It is past midnight, and someone is holding a lantern over a sheet of paper and telling you to make your mark. You are standing on the deck of a small ship, riding at anchor in a warm black bay somewhere in the Caribbean, and the air is thick and wet and smells of tar and rum and unwashed men. The paper is a list of rules, read out to you a moment ago in a low voice, and now a rough hand is pushing a pen at you, and every face turned toward you in the lantern light is waiting to see what you do. Behind those faces you can just make out the shape of the thing you have joined. A low, fast, lean little ship, her guns run out, and above her, hanging dead still in the hot night air, a black flag. You have heard stories about these men your whole life. Freedom, you were told. No masters, gold and rum and adventure and the open sea, and no one to tell you when to get up in the morning. And here you are, pen in hand, about to sign your name into the most romantic story in the world. And I am here to tell you, before the ink is even dry, that you would not last a week. Not one. And the reasons why are going to surprise you at almost every turn, because the true story of these men is stranger, and in some ways far better, and in every way that matters far worse than the story you think you know. So make your mark, and let me show you what you just signed up for. My name's Marcus, and I should introduce myself, because I am the sort of man who reads a ship's articles for fun. I used to teach history to teenagers who mostly wanted to be somewhere else, and when the textbook let me down, which was often, I took up the strangest hobby a grown man can have, which is going out on weekends and actually living the past. The cold, the fire, the bad food, the no plumbing, all of it on purpose. My wife, B, has watched me do genuinely baffling things in the name of history, and of all the worlds I have crawled into, the one people most beg me to make romantic, and the one that most stubbornly refuses, is this one, the pirate. Because here is my problem, and it is going to become your problem for the next half hour. The truth about these men is so much more interesting than the legend that I get almost angry about the legend. The films gave you a swashbuckler with a parrot and a treasure map. The real thing was a floating experiment in something close to democracy, crewed by desperate, doomed men, most of whom would be dead inside 2 years. Both of those are more astonishing than the cartoon. And you, with your soft hands and your clean water and your absolute certainty that you'd have thrived out here, you would have been a corpse in a hammock before you ever saw a doubloon. Let me prove it. First, we have to kill the fantasy, because you smuggled one aboard whether you know it or not. You've got the picture in your head. The dashing rogue in the fine coat, the plank poked out over shark-filled water, the chest of gold buried on a palm-fringed island, marked with an X on a crumbling map, the sword fight in the rigging, and the beautiful escape into the sunset. It is a wonderful story. It is almost entirely invention. A thing built, long after the fact, by novelists, and much later by film studios out of a few real threads and an enormous amount of imagination. Here's the real shape of it. The golden age of piracy, the classic one, the one all the legends grew out of, was a startlingly short window, roughly the 10 years from about 1716 to 1726, mostly in the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic. And these men were not, for the most part, chasing galleons groaning with Aztec gold. They were preying on ordinary merchant ships, slow, fat, poorly defended traders carrying cloth, sugar, tobacco, timber, provisions, and yes, sometimes coin. It was less pillaging a treasure fleet and more mugging the delivery vans of the 18th century Atlantic. Unglamorous cargo, taken by hungry men in tiny ships in a world that was already closing in on them. That is the war we are going to live in today, not the treasure map. The tiny ship, the rotten pork, the fever below decks, and the noose waiting at the end. Because that is what would actually have killed you. But let's start with the honest question. Who were you before you stood on that deck with a pen in your hand? Who actually became a pirate? Not, for the most part, born villains. Overwhelmingly, these were sailors already, men who knew the sea because it took skill to sail these ships, and you cannot pirate what you cannot crew. And most of them came out of the two hardest schools on the water, the merchant service and the Royal Navy. Think about what that means. On a merchant ship or a naval vessel of this era, an ordinary sailor's life was brutal. The pay was low and often cheated. The food was foul, and the discipline could be savage, floggings at the whim of a captain who was, on his own deck, very nearly a god. Men deserted. Men were pressed and resented it. Men watched their wages stolen and their backs opened and thought, there has to be something better than this. And piracy was, in a hard and narrow sense, the something better. That is the thing you must hold onto to understand everything that follows. These men were not fleeing an easy life for a wicked one. They were fleeing a savagely unfair life for a dangerous, doomed, but astonishingly fairer one. They knew the odds were terrible. They took them anyway because the legal alternative was its own kind of slow death. So no, you did not run away to sea to find freedom. You ran away from something worse. And now we come to the part that genuinely stops my students in their tracks every single time. The part that flips the whole picture upside down. Because that piece of paper you just signed on the dark deck, that was not a formality. That was, in a way, the whole point. Before a pirate voyage began, the crew drew up a set of written rules and agreed to them together. They called them the Articles, the ship's Articles, and every man signed or made his mark and swore to them. And these Articles were, by the standards of the year 1720, a small revolution. Because remember what these men had fled. A world where the captain was an absolute tyrant, where you had no vote, no voice, no share, and no recourse. And on the pirate ship, they built, quite deliberately, the opposite of the thing that had ground them down. Start with the captain. On a pirate ship, the captain was elected. The crew chose him, usually for his skill in a fight and his nerve and his luck, and crucially, if he lost their confidence, they could vote him out and choose another. His near-total authority applied in one place and one place only, in the chase and in the battle, when someone had to give orders instantly and be obeyed. The rest of the time in the great decisions, where to sail, who to attack, what to do with a prize, the crew decided, often by vote. The captain who forgot that, who started lording it over his men or hogging the plunder, could find himself deposed, marooned, or worse. He served at the pleasure of the men below him. Sit with how radical that is for the age. Kings ruled by the will of God, merchant captains ruled by the lash, and a shipful of outlaws ruled themselves by a show of hands, and they didn't stop there. To keep the captain honest, they elected a second officer whose whole job was to check his power, the quartermaster. The quartermaster represented the crew. He handled the distribution of food and plunder. He often led the boarding parties. In many disputes he, not the captain, settled things, and he could veto the captain in day-to-day matters. It was, more or less, a separation of powers worked out by illiterate sailors, a lifetime before most of the world's citizens had any such thing. Then there was the money, and here the fairness gets almost startling. When a pirate crew took a prize, the plunder was not grabbed by a captain and doled out as scraps. It was split by shares, and the shares were written into the articles in advance, so every man knew exactly what he was owed. And the gap between top and bottom was tiny by the standards of the time. The captain might get 1.5 shares or 2. The quartermaster and skilled men like the carpenter and the gunner might get 1.25 shares, 1.5 shares. And the ordinary crewman, you got 1 full share. Compare that to a merchant voyage, where the owners and the captain took nearly everything and the sailor got a pittance. On the pirate ship, the man who did the fighting got very nearly as much as the man who led it. And here is the detail that honestly I love the most, the one that sounds like it can't possibly be true and is. The articles often included what we would now recognize as workers' compensation. Insurance. Written, agreed compensation for injury. Lose an eye in a fight, you got an agreed sum off the top before the shares were split. Lose a leg, more. A right arm, the most valuable to a working sailor, was commonly compensated at the highest rate of all, a figure often given as around 600 pieces of 8, or a number of slaves, depending on the articles. The point is not the exact sum, which varied ship to ship. The point is the principle. These outlaws had a disability fund, agreed in advance and paid out fairly, at a time when the Navy would send a maimed man home with next to nothing. The pirates looked after their wounded better than the greatest empire on earth looked after its own. Now, I can feel you doubting me, and good, you should. This sounds too neat, too flattering, like I'm trying to sell you a gang of murderers as a floating parliament. So let me tell you where this comes from, because getting it right matters to me more than a good story. Much of what we understand about the democracy of the pirate ship comes from the careful work of serious historians who went back to the actual records, the trial transcripts, the depositions, the surviving articles. The historian Marcus Rediker, in his book Villains of All Nations, makes exactly this case. That piracy was, for the men in it, a kind of revolt against the brutal conditions of the merchant and naval world, and that they built a strikingly egalitarian order in its place. And David Cordingly, in Under the Black Flag, is the one who spends whole chapters separating the real pirates from the Hollywood ones. When I tell you the captain was elected and the wounded were paid, I'm not handing you a folk tale. I'm handing you what the documents say. And when the documents run out, I'll tell you that too. So that's the astonishing part, the fair, self-governing little republic bobbing in the bay. Now let me start taking it apart because you still have to live on it. Look at the ship again. She is small. That is not an accident, it's the whole strategy. Pirates favored small, fast, shallow vessels, sloops and brigantines, because speed was survival. A small ship could run down a fat merchantman, dart into shallow water where a big warship couldn't follow, and vanish among the islands. But small and fast also means cramped, wet, and stuffed with far more men than the ship was built to hold, because you needed a big crew to overwhelm a prize and work the guns. So your democratic paradise is also a floating tin of packed, sweating bodies with nowhere to go. And that black flag hanging over you, let's talk about it, because it is the most misunderstood object in the whole story. The Jolly Roger in its various designs, the skull, the crossed bones, the hourglass, the skeleton was not, first and foremost, a boast. It was a tool, a psychological weapon. Here is the logic, and it is beautifully cold. A pirate does not actually want to fight. A fight is expensive. It gets your men killed, it damages your own ship, and worst of all, it can wreck or sink the very cargo you came to steal. The ideal capture is one where the merchantman simply gives up without a shot, and so you fly the black flag as you close in, a signal that says, in effect, surrender now and you will likely be spared. Resist and we will show no mercy. The flag was a brand, a reputation made visible, designed to make terror do the work that cannon would otherwise have to. Most prizes, faced with that flag and a deck full of screaming armed men, surrendered. Which was exactly the point. The scariest thing about the Jolly Roger is how rational it was. But I've been letting you enjoy this. The clever flag, the fair shares, the elected captain. So now let me turn, because here is where the whole romantic thing rots from the inside, literally. Here is what would actually have killed you, and it is not a sword, and it is not the Navy, not at first. It is the same quiet enemy that killed sailors everywhere in this age. It's the food, the water, and the fever. Think about where you are. A tiny wooden ship, packed with men in the tropics, heat, damp, insects, and no refrigeration anywhere in the world. Your food is what would keep in that heat. Ship's biscuit, hard as a roof tile, that on any long cruise became riddled with weevils, so that men learned to eat it in the dark rather than see what was in it. Salt meat out of a cask, gray and tough and swimming in brine, and your water, stored in wooden casks, went slimy and green and foul within weeks, which is a large part of why everyone drank so much beer and rum and grog. Not for the fun of it, though there was that, but because the alcohol was often safer than the water. And on that diet, on a long enough voyage, came scurvy, the great wasting sickness of the Age of Sail, caused, though nobody yet understood it, by the lack of the thing we call vitamin C. Your gums swell and bleed, your teeth loosen, old healed wounds mysteriously open again, and you sink into an exhaustion that kills, and crowded together in filth, with no idea how disease spread. Pirate crews were swept by dysentery and by the tropical fevers, the mosquito-borne killers of the Caribbean, though no one knew to blame the mosquito that could empty a ship faster than any battle. This is the fact the legend absolutely cannot digest, so let me say it as plainly as I can. Across the Golden Age, disease and the ordinary rot of life at sea killed far more pirates than combat ever did. You were vastly more likely to die shivering and delirious in a hammock, of a fever whose name you didn't know, than to die in a glorious sword fight on a sunlit deck. And that is why the careers were so short. Most pirates of this era practiced the trade for only a year or two before it ended in death or capture or the noose. You did not retire a rich pirate to a beach. You mostly didn't retire at all. So let's take that short, sick, dangerous little life and start knocking the myths off it one by one, because almost everything you picture is either exaggerated or simply made up. Walking the plank. The plank poked out over the water. The prisoner prodded along it at sword point to a watery death. It is the single most iconic pirate image there is, and it is, as far as the real Golden Age goes, essentially fiction, a dramatic flourish popularized by later stories and pictures. There is very little evidence that it was any kind of standard practice. Real pirates who wanted to be rid of someone had faster, uglier ways, and mostly they didn't bother. A surrendered crew was more useful recruited, robbed, or simply left behind. The plank is theater. Lovely theater, not history, buried treasure, the chest of gold in the sand, the map with the X. Also, overwhelmingly, a myth. Think about it from the pirate's point of view. Why on earth would you bury your money? You wanted to spend it fast, loudly, on rum and companionship and gambling in a friendly port, because you might well be dead by the spring. Plunder was usually divided and blown through almost at once. The whole romance of buried hoards rests very largely on one real exception, Captain Kidd, who did bury a cache of treasure before his arrest. A story that got wildly inflated afterward and helped launch 1,000 fictional treasure maps. One man, one buried cache, blown up by legend into an entire imagined industry. And here's one where I have to be scrupulously fair, because it's a fan favorite, the eye patch. You've heard the clever theory that pirates wore an eye patch not because they'd lost an eye, but to keep one eye always adapted to the dark, so they could flip it up and see instantly when they went below decks into the gloom. It's a genuinely brilliant idea. It might even be true, but I have to flag it honestly. There is no good historical evidence that pirates actually did this. It's a modern hypothesis, not a documented practice. So enjoy it as the clever notion it is, but file it under maybe, not fact. On this channel, we don't pass off a good guess as the truth. Now, the legends did grow from real men, and some of them were extraordinary. So let me introduce a few of your new colleagues, the ones whose names survived. The most successful pirate of the whole era is one most people have never heard of, Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart. He took an astonishing number of ships, a figure often given as around 400, which makes the famous names look like amateurs. And he shatters the stereotype at every turn. He was famously well-dressed, favoring fine clothes, and he was, of all things, a teetotaler who preferred tea to rum on a ship where rum was practically a food group. He ran a tight, disciplined operation, and he was killed in battle in 1722, and his death is often taken as the moment the Golden Age began truly to end. Then there's the one you have heard of, Edward Teach, Blackbeard. And the interesting thing about Blackbeard is how much of his terror was, like the Jolly Roger, deliberate theater. He cultivated a monstrous image, the great black beard braided, and by legend, smoking slow-burning matches under his hat to wreathe himself in smoke like a devil, precisely so that his prey would surrender in fright rather than fight. He blockaded the whole port of Charleston, and he too was hunted down and killed in 1718. His fearsome reputation did a great deal of his fighting for him, which is the whole pirate strategy in a single man. And two names I never skip, because the legend loves to forget that women were there. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed and fought as pirates in the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. By the accounts of their trial, when the ship was finally taken, the two women fought on deck while much of the male crew hid below, a detail too good and too well attested to leave out. And there was Charles Vane, one of the fiercest and least reconcilable of them all. These were the real people under the cartoon, braver, stranger, and far more doomed than the films let them be, because doomed is the word. And now we come to how it ended, how it always ended, which is the part the adventure stories quietly leave out. The Golden Age was short because the most powerful navy in the world decided to end it. After about 1718, the British Crown changed tactics. First, the offer of a royal pardon to pirates who would give up the trade, and then, for those who wouldn't, relentless, well-funded pursuit. Naval squadrons hunted them across the Caribbean. Colonial governors who had once winked at piracy turned on it. The safe harbors were closed, and the men who were caught were put on trial and in large numbers hanged. In London, they were hanged at a particular place with grim deliberateness, Execution Dock at Wapping on the edge of the Thames, in the very tideway where the ships came and went, so that sailors passing by would see. And for the worst and most notorious, the punishment did not end with death. Their bodies were gibbeted, hung up in an iron cage by the river's edge and left there, tarred against the weather, for months or years as a warning to every seaman who rowed past. I won't dwell on it. I never do this to make you flinch, but hold the plain fact of it. The state did not merely want these men dead. It wanted them displayed, an empty iron cage over the water where a man used to be, saying to every sailor tempted by that black flag, "This is where the freedom ends." And it worked. Within a few years, the golden age of piracy was essentially over. Now let me keep the promise I make every time, because getting it right matters more to me than scaring you. When I hand you a number, 400 ships, 600 pieces of 8, a career of 2 years, hold it a little loosely. These come from imperfect records, trial transcripts, a few surviving sets of articles, the accounts of captives, and one enormously influential early book about the pirates whose author we're not even certain of. Ships and captains differed. Some pirate crews were fairly governed and comparatively restrained. Others were led by genuine sadists, and the violence they did to captured crews was real and ugly, and I'm not sanding that off. The democracy was real, so was the cruelty. Both things are true at once, and anyone who tells you pirates were simply noble rebels or simply monsters is selling you half a story. I'd rather give you the whole, complicated thing. So let's be honest about where you specifically would break. And notice, one more time, that almost none of it is the sword fight. The food grinds you down in the first weeks, the weevils, the salt, the sameness. The foul water and the close, filthy, tropical crowding invite the fever that circles the whole time, patient, waiting for a packed little ship to do its work for it. The sheer physical labor of sailing a small, overcrowded vessel in all weathers breaks your soft, modern hands. And hanging over all of it every single day is the knowledge, which every man aboard carried, that this ends one way. Not a beach and a treasure chest, a fever or a battle or a cage over the Thames. You signed articles that were fairer than anything the legal world offered you, and you signed them knowing they were, in all likelihood, your death warrant, because the alternative was a slower death with worse company. You would not last a week, and I mean it precisely and not as an insult, not because you're weak, because you're modern. You have been shaped, every hour of your life, by clean water and fresh food and medicine, and the deep, unexamined certainty that you will probably grow old. And this world was built out of the exact opposite of every one of those things, and it asked men not to win it, but simply to endure it for the short, sharp remainder of their lives. You've made your mark on the articles by a stranger's lantern, learned that your murderous new shipmates vote and share and insure each other more fairly than any king's navy, tapped the weevils out of your breakfast, and felt the first cold touch of a fever in a hammock full of sweating men. And that's day one. You're already dead. All right, not literally, not on the first day most likely, but the version of you that came aboard expecting rum and gold and sunsets, that version is already gone, drowned somewhere between the black flag and the water cask. And now you'd have to do the whole thing again tomorrow, on borrowed time, for a career that history says will be measured in months. And here's where I turn all of it around on you, because I didn't drag you through the fever and the foul water just to make you grateful for your tap and your fridge, though you should be. Whenever I sit with this story, the thing that stays with me isn't the treasure that mostly wasn't there. It's that little contradiction bobbing in the bay. The fairest society many of these men would ever know was also the deadliest. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's the whole secret. Ask yourself why a shipful of hardened outlaws bothered to elect their captains and share their plunder and pay their wounded. It wasn't sweetness. It was that the job was so lethal, and these men so desperate and so free of any other master, that no tyrant could hold them. You cannot rule by fear men who have already accepted they are probably going to die, and who can vote you out or maroon you tomorrow. The democracy grew directly out of the danger. The fairness was forged by the fact that everyone aboard was equal in the one thing that mattered most, equally doomed. And that's the uncomfortable mirror I want to hold up to you, on your side of 300 years. We romanticize the freedom of these men, the no masters, no alarm clock, wind in your hair freedom, and we quietly edit out the price of it. But the deal was never freedom for comfort. It was a shorter, sicker, more terrifying life in exchange for a say in it. These men traded decades for dignity. They swapped a long, safe, humiliating servitude for a brief, brutal, self-governed run at the open sea. And here's the honest question I can't quite shake. Given the actual terms, not the film, the real terms, would you? You, with your long life and your clean water and your 1,000 small comforts and your quiet, careful, well-managed days. Because I suspect the reason we love pirates so much is not that we want the danger. It's that we envy the say. So that's my question, and I do read the comments, so tell me honestly. Knowing the real terms now, the fever, the foul water, the 2-year odds and the cage over the Thames at the end, but also the vote and the fair share, and the men beside you who chose you and whom you chose, would you have made your mark on those articles? Not the movie pirate. This one. Tell me below, and be decent to each other down there. We're all a little in love with a story we'd never actually survive. I'll be off to keep toughening up my nephew Cody, who last week described the Wi-Fi going down for an afternoon as, and I quote, genuinely unsurvivable. We are going to have a conversation about scurvy, and if standing on that dark deck with me made you look at your soft, safe, wonderfully long little life a bit differently, and if you want me to drop you into another world where you also, let's be honest, would not last, then subscribe and come back, because I have always got somewhere worse to take you. My name's Marcus. Mind the ink, and be nice to your clean water and your boring, precious old age tonight. You've no idea how good you've got it.